You hear the word concussion all the time, especially in sports, right? But what's actually happening inside someone's head when they get one? Well, today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this so-called invisible injury. We'll look at the science, the diagnosis, the whole deal. For a lot of us, the whole conversation about sports and brain injuries really hit the mainstream with that 2015 movie Concussion. You had Will Smith playing Dr. Bennett Omalu, and it really opened people's eyes to the serious long-term damage from repeated hits to the head. And that movie was based on a totally true and pretty dramatic story. It's about this forensic pathologist, Dr. Bennett Omalu. Back in 2002, he was looking at the brain of a former NFL player, Mike Webster, and he found something new. He basically discovered a disease we now know as CTE. And his discovery, whoa, it set off a huge firestorm because it pointed a finger directly at football, linking all those hits to serious long-term brain damage. So the movie showed us the scary long-term outcome. But it kind of left a big question hanging, didn't it? What is the actual injury that starts this whole chain reaction? What's at the center of it all? To get that, we've got to look at the science. All right, let's get right down to it. What is a concussion? And more importantly, why do they call it the invisible injury? Okay, so the official fancy definition is a traumatic brain injury induced by biomechanical forces. Sounds a bit clinical, right? But all it really means is an injury caused by some kind of physical force, either a direct hit or even just a violent shaking of the head. But the really fascinating part isn't the hit itself, it's what happens inside the brain right after. And listen, if you take one thing away from this, let it be this. A concussion is a functional disturbance. It's not a structural injury. The best way to think about it is like a computer. The hardware, the physical brain, is fine, but the software has a glitch. The signals are all scrambled up, and that is why it's the invisible injury. You can do an MRI, a CT scan, and the brain looks totally normal, even while the person feels awful. Okay, so knowing that helps us bust a few big myths. Myth number one, it has to be a direct hit to the head. Nope, a hard hit to the body can cause a whiplash that's just as bad. Myth two, symptoms are immediate. Not always. They can pop up right away or they can take hours to develop. And here's a big one. You do not have to be knocked out to have a concussion. That's probably the most common misconception out there. And because it's about function, not structure, the symptoms can be all over the map. One person might just have a bad headache and feel a little foggy. Another could have terrible dizziness, blurry vision, feel sick to their stomach. It's just so different for everyone, which makes it really tricky. So, if the symptoms are so varied, how in the world do you deal with a possible concussion right there on the field, in the middle of the game? Well, the first response always comes down to one word: safety. Now, it's super important to know that when you see a player getting checked on the sideline, that's just a first look. It's a screening. They're looking for any red flags, but they are not making a final diagnosis right then and there. And that leads us to this single most important rule in all of concussion management. It's simple, it's memorable, and it's non-negotiable. If in doubt, set it out. Seriously, when you're dealing with the brain, you just can't take any chances. And that simple phrase is backed by two ironclad rules. Rule number one, if there is any doubt, any at all, that an athlete might have a concussion, they are out of the game, period. And rule number two, there is absolutely, positively no returning to play on the same day. This is critical to protect the brain when it's at its most vulnerable. Okay, so if the sideline check is just the first step, what happens next? How do doctors actually diagnose this thing? Well, it's not one single test. Think of it more like they have this whole toolkit they use to put together the pieces of a very complex puzzle. Let me be super clear about this. There is no magic test for concussion. There's no blood test, no brain scan, no single machine that just spits out a yes or no answer. It's all about clinical detective work, really. So what are these doctors looking for? They're looking for patterns, or what they call clusters of symptoms. This helps them figure out which systems in the brain are struggling. For example, are we seeing cognitive issues like problems with thinking or memory? Or is it vestibular, meaning it's affecting their balance? Maybe it's ocular, messing with our vision. Each of these clusters is a clue. Let's talk about one of the biggest pieces of that puzzle, checking out someone's cognitive function. Basically, how well is their brain doing its job? Thinking, processing things, remembering stuff. And to do that, they often use computerized tests. A common one is called CNS vital signs. The great thing about a test like this is that it's objective. It gives you hard data on things like reaction time, memory, and attention. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of the equation. And the whole process is really controlled to make sure the results are accurate. The investigator gives a set of standard instructions. The athlete goes through about 7 different mini tests, and it's all done in a super quiet room with no distractions. You can almost think of it as a controlled experiment to see exactly how the brain is performing. But thinking and memory are only part of the story. Another huge piece is testing what's called postural control. It's a fancy term for something we do every second of every day. Balance. And yeah, there's a whole different set of tools just for testing balance. You've got things like the BSS test, where an athlete has to hold different stances, sometimes on a squishy pad. Even a simple walk down a line can show a lot. And in high-tech setups, they might use something called a force plate, which can measure tiny, tiny shifts in balance that you could never see with your own eyes. So we've got all these tools, all these rules. What does this all mean for the future? How are we going to keep protecting athletes' brains? So I guess the big takeaway here is this. There's no easy answer. Diagnosing a concussion really is like being a detective. You have to take all these different clues, what the athlete is feeling, the results from cognitive tests, how they do on balance tests, and piece them all together to get the full story of what's happening inside their brain. And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. We know athletes are only getting faster, stronger, and more powerful. So how is brain science going to keep up? How will it evolve to keep these incredible athletes safe? The answer to that is going to define the future of sport for a long, long time.